invite Mr. Frédéric Oudéa for the keynote speech.
Your Excellency, Minister Maït, dear Augustin, dear Philippe, it's very nice to introduce this series of sessions with the formidable task to avoid having you falling asleep for the rest of the afternoon. I must say we will cover a lot of different topics. I will have the pleasure to exchange a minute with Alireza Zaimi from the PIF, and we'll talk about, of course, the Middle East. What I'd like to say is if there are different common features, I think in particular it's around time. And I think thinking about long-term dedication, long-term commitment, the Prime Minister was saying that we as bankers have to think about effectively financing the economy, and more than ever, I have the feeling that when we commit in emerging markets, in developing economies, that's exactly what we do. And I must say I'm very proud that in 2010, myself, I made the decision much before this very strong initiative to further develop Saudi Arabia, to enhance our presence, which I think give us a fantastic opportunity to develop in partnership, as we will discuss with Saudi and, of course, more globally, countries in the Middle East. But it's fair to say I'd like to focus on Africa. Because at the end of the day, when I think about Europe, and we tend to be European-centric, but we should not forget Africa, which I think in the coming 20 to 30 years might be the biggest opportunity as well as the biggest challenge for Europe. When I say this, I have, of course, in mind the demographic trend, and you know the United Nations just released recently a report on the demographic trends in the different continents, and clearly the only continent which will see its population rising very significantly is Africa. Needless to say that if Europe is able to accompany the local growth of these economies, it is for our companies a fantastic opportunity. And I must say, I've seen in the last 10 years more and more interest of Western companies to develop. But of course, beyond the investment from foreign companies, we have to ensure a sustainable and local development of African countries. And if we do not succeed, just imagine what it might mean in terms of immigration trends and pressure. And when I say this, I remember a figure which was given to me, to be frank, I did not check, but just to reflect what it could mean, I think if you were to apply the same flows of migration between Africa and Europe than the ones that you saw between Mexico and the US, it may be 350 million African people who might move to Europe, one-to-one basically with Europe. And I tend to think that for many reasons, it will be very difficult for Europe to absorb all these people. So what I mean by this, when we've been thinking about Africa, when I've been thinking about Africa, I have the feeling that really contributing to this development of the economies is absolutely critical. Société Générale has been in Africa for quite a long term. It's part of a DNA in the story of this company, which is more than 150 years, to project outside. We have celebrated more than 100 years of presence in Morocco a few years ago, more than 50 years of presence in countries like Ivory Coast or Cameroon. We know these countries. We've been there for quite a while. And we have, of course, further expanded our presence beyond, if I may say, traditional countries for a French bank. For example, recently in Ghana, in Mozambique, in Kenya, opening a rep office recently there. So we are in an expanding way. We have more than 12,000 people working in Africa, more than 1,000 branches. And as you can see, this capacity to have leadership position in these countries. We are number one in Ivory Coast, number 2 in Senegal, number 1 also and 2 in Cameroon, very strong presence, is for us a great benefit. We are developing successfully because, again, we look at the long term and we have ambitions to grow. I tend to think that there is more and more also interest from government, from multilateral institutions. I was very happy to shake hands with Philippe Lewerou. We have entertained a very long-term relationship with him and IFC to, of course, develop also activities jointly. And effectively, from national agencies, l'Agence Française du Développement, as you know, put Africa also as a top priority in terms of investment. So we have also this unique capacity as an international bank to accompany these large institutions. And we are living a paradox. You will see, you have seen already, but you will see further large international banks with relatively small presence exiting Africa. It's part of a more general refocusing. Let's face it, we as banks have to select our battles. And it's probably fair to say that if you just have a presence in a few countries, you don't have the critical mass to invest. You don't have the capacity to accompany local companies with this integration, regional integration, which is there, and that actually African banks are also developing and able to accompany these clients. You will not compete. So it's fair to say with Standard Chartered, we are the major international bank with this commitment and this presence, and we will pursue this development. Let me just highlight that we have 1 year ago launched a new initiative to accelerate, initiative that we've called Grandir avec l'Afrique, Grow with Africa, with 3 major pillars. The first one is effectively, as it was mentioned, ensuring the financing of infrastructure. There is a very big need of infrastructure. I think fundamentally, when you look at the growth of emerging markets, economies, you see that close to half of the needs are in Africa. Different fields, energy, roads, harbors, bridges, etc. We are a world leader there. We can play a role, and we've put resources on the ground. We've put a dedicated team to accompany the financing of these infrastructure. Second, beyond the large local corporates, SMEs. When you think about job creation, the need for job creations, you need to have a density of SMEs. And it's fair to say it's not so easy for African entrepreneurs to get scale. So we are there. We will commit an additional 4 billion euros of financing to the local African economies, to the SMEs in the next 5 years. And we have created, and I was very happy to inaugurate the first Maison de l'Entreprise in Senegal with partners, because this development also has partners, including in France and locally, of course. We're very happy to create an environment to be able to give advisory services, provide additional tools for companies to grow. And the third is around financial inclusion and the capacity to support the structuring of certain sectors. And here we don't talk necessarily about private, traditional banking. I have in mind more what digital technologies can bring. We have developed a wallet, an electronic wallet, a brand called Yup, which enables any African citizen today in 6 countries, tomorrow in more, to effectively be able, without any banking account, deposit money, collect money, pay, with, again, the partnership of retail networks, oil stations, in a very secure way. And when I say this, it is, of course, financial inclusion. But beyond, when you think about certain business model, and I have in mind in particular the agriculture sector and the agro-food sector, which are still so important in Africa, or the development of energy projects, but not the big ones, not the big utilities, but more decentralized structures taking advantage of renewable, clearly the capacity to secure the payment, thanks to this kind of system, versus just cash payment with all the issues of security logistics, is a key edge. And we want effectively to further develop these tools, and I think that we will contribute to the development of new sectors, and of course, more also transparency, which is also very important for the local budgets. As you can see, for me, the development of Africa, of course, fuels the benefit of Société Générale, the ambition that we have to grow. Can I say developing in emerging economies today is really good? Can I just explain to our friends from outside that living in a world of negative rates is very tough for banking? When you see the evolution, it is a little bit worrying. At least in these countries, you have good prospects for growth, you have normal interest rate curve, and effectively plenty of things to do because the penetration of banking services is still relatively limited. So if you wish, this commitment fundamentally fuels first the ambition of Société Générale as a company. But I would say that beyond, I think that, and when people talk about social responsibility, sense of purpose, more than ever doing business also in Africa fuels that. We have, beyond the traditional commitments that most corporates will take on social responsibility around climate change, and it was reminded also that Paris is a key center for that, and French banks and Société Générale are world leaders in that front. Beyond being a good employer, beyond effectively being focused on the client benefit, beyond all these elements which are not that differentiating, we have elected Africa, the development of Africa, as one of our 6 goals for beyond our own development, I would say our commitment to social and general good. And when I say this, it is also through beyond what we do, our foundation. I'm also very proud to say that this foundation that I now chair, which has more than 10 years of existence, has now a dedicated program to help African population, African young person to grow. We do that with partners. We will dedicate 1 million euros a year to this project with partners, French partners, but beyond. And I think it is very much in sync with this idea of trying to help and develop Africa. So as you can see, as a conclusion, Africa is a land of promise, is a land of challenge. We mentioned the climate change. The African economies might be also among the ones which might be the most affected by the increase of temperature. I think we have to have as a common objective to help Africa to grow, to be more independent and with the capacity effectively to feed its people, to feed the growth and jobs needs of its population. I think we are doing that with a lot of proudness. And may I just also, to finish, say a hello to our colleagues from APSA, Mrs. Wendy and Lucas Bell, who is the chairman of APSA. We've signed an MOU to further develop together the business. Africa is also about fantastic partnership and great development of human relationship. Thank you very much.
Good afternoon and welcome once again, ladies and gentlemen, and your excellencies. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Hadley Gamble. I am the CNBC anchor for the Middle East and also the senior international correspondent for the network. Frederick, it's great to see you. Thank you again for joining us. And Ali Reza Al-Zaimi, you are the executive director of Saudi Arabia's Public Investment Fund. Gentlemen, welcome. We're going to kick off this conversation just really setting the scene, I think, for what the Public Investment Fund has been up to over the last year or two, but also where they're headed, and also, of course, where the opportunities are in Saudi Arabia. We've come quite a long way, I have to say, since the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, Mohammed bin Salman, announced the Vision 2030. At that time, I was one of 2 female journalists in a very crowded room. And I have to tell you, covering the region for 10 years, Saudi Arabia has, in fact, come a very, very long way. So a lot of excitement surrounding that. But of course, all of that against the global context of trade tensions, tensions in the region, stress to the energy markets, as you were saying, low-rate environment, and a lot of questions, of course, about leadership as well, because you had the murder of Jamal Khashoggi, which put a damper on things, sort of took the blush off the rose. And then at the same point, you have that delay to the Aramco IPO, which so many people were very excited about. But I want to kick off with you, Ali Reza. Walk us through how the public investment fund strategy has changed and shifted.
Sure. Thank you, Hadley. And before starting, I'd like just to say hello to His Excellency Minister Mohammed Maid. Very nice to have a minister of a friendly country with us in the audience. Hadley, you know very well the region and in particular the kingdom, but maybe for our audience, it would be good to take a step back and say what PIF is, Public Investment Fund. So we are both an old and a new organization. We are old because we were created in 1971. And we were a department of Ministry of Finance in the kingdom, and we had a completely different role of helping I would say the companies in the kingdom to develop. And there are a lot of success stories within that mandate. For example, SABIC is one. SABIC is now a giant of the petrochemical industry. This is a company that PIF helped create simply because being an oil-rich country, the idea was that can we help industries transform that oil into different products. In 2015, with the change of the leadership in the country and the announcement of Vision 2030, the mandate of the Public Investment Fund changed. We became effectively a sovereign wealth fund. We are the main sovereign wealth fund in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. There are other sovereign wealth funds that we own that have particular focus. For example, SALIC, who's looking at food security for the kingdom, and Sanabil and others that sit below PIF. And with that really came with a big challenge, was to how to transform a old department of the Ministry of Finance with 40 people into one of the, that's our ambition, to become the most impactful sovereign wealth fund in the world. And with that came all the different challenges between, what our investment strategy should be, how should we finance them, how should we have our governance in place, how should we influence the companies in which we are invested. Just to give you a sense, we own companies that represent roughly 1/4 of the total market capitalization of Saudi Arabia. And I wouldn't say that we were extremely active in the governance of these companies. That has changed completely. So now we systematically have board representation. We make our voice heard, and we've made a lot of progress on that. So today, what is PIF? PIF today is, if you look at our board, our chairman is His Royal Highness the Crown Prince, and we have various ministers in the country that sit at the who sit at the board of director and the subcommittees. So you have the main ministers, the Minister of Oil and Mining, the Minister of Finance, the Minister of Economy and Planning, now the Minister also of Foreign Affairs. I would say a number of very high-profile ministers. And that's really facilitated our task as well into transforming this organization within Vision 2030. Our investments today are organized in 6 pools of investment, 4 in Saudi, and we can go through them if you wish to, and 2 in international. Ultimately, the idea is to say today, when you look at the economy of Saudi Arabia, it's still very much dependent on oil. And if you look at the oil prices and the volatility of oil prices over time, you go back to 98, oil price was $10 a barrel. Now is higher, but of course it fluctuates, and the challenge that creates for a country of the size of Saudi Arabia. Just to remind you, the size is we're talking a country of 30 million people, is a G20 economy of close to $700 billion. So this is a large country by any measure, and therefore relying on one main source of income that is volatile is not a good position to be in. And therefore the idea is to transform PIF in order to make investments and the revenues generated by this investment to never replace the oil. We will always have a large oil revenue, but complement the revenues that are generated from oil. So one thing that we don't do at PIF is to invest in oil and gas, because we already have exposure. So we want to diversify away, and our investments in international assets, by definition, they have to be something that complement those oil revenue. So
Walk us through those numbers specifically.
sorry?
Walk us through those numbers specifically.
Sure. So today, okay, in terms of numbers, PIF 40 people, today we are more than 500 people. Our assets under management, we celebrated a good milestone earlier this year. So we just surpassed 1 trillion Saudi riyal. $1 is 3.75 riyal for those in the audience. So that's a bit more than $300 million. And we are growing. And the two main, I would say, events that have happened and we are expecting is one, was that we sold our 70% interest in SABIC, the same company that we helped develop, to our colleagues at Saudi Aramco. So that was a transaction that we signed on in March this year. And of course, these are two very large companies putting their assets together, and we have to go through the regulatory process in order to complete the transaction. And the second one is, of course, the IPO of Saudi Aramco. And the proceeds of the IPO of Saudi Aramco will flow into PIF. Now, if you put these two events together, $70 billion of SABIC proceeds and the proceeds of the IPO of Saudi Aramco, you get the size of a GDP of a small country. Not so much. It's actually going to be more than the GDP of Hungary, we were saying. And that puts us in a very challenging position, because we have to deploy that amount of capital in a prudent way in projects that offer growth for the long term. You have to appreciate that we are looking at 2030. So we are not in the business of investing in more mature companies, but rather in growth companies, in order to create this second source of revenue for the kingdom ultimately.
Walk me through this in terms of your presence inside Saudi Arabia, because there are so many opportunities internally as well. And obviously, the Public Investment Fund has something called the Fund of Funds, which is an investment fund to invest in startups, funds that invest in startups. So there are opportunities to work together and certain synergies. But I thought it was interesting when you were talking, Frederic, about Africa and the opportunities, as well as the need to be investing in Africa. There's also a moral imperative to be investing in the Middle East, because the majority of folks that are in the Middle East now are under the age of 30. And it's a moral imperative in a way, isn't it? And a security imperative to make sure that they have employment.
But you know, it's exactly the reasoning we had with Saudi Arabia. We have an historical relationship with different counterparts in Saudi Arabia. We are a large bank involved in the energy sector, so with Aramco, with La Sama, the central bank. We developed historically a relationship with a series of companies which have been developing internationally. But it's fair to say in 2010, I decided to enhance the present because exactly as Ali Reza said, Saudi Arabia is the large countries in the Gulf. Stability is absolutely needed, not just for the region, but for the world. And I personally saw an opportunity. There was not yet this ambition 2015, decided in 2015, but you could feel that also with this inflection in the long run of oil prices, a potential opportunity to see new developments. It's fair to say, since 2015, there are new opportunities for a bank like Société Générale, and that's why we further committed also. First of all, we could discuss also in this huge ambition, there is the development of infrastructure of all kinds. There's the development of renewable energy, precisely to diversify and effectively contribute to the climate change. We are a world leader in everything which is around renewable energy. Great things to be done there. It could be around the smart cities. We have a knowledge of that with all the European companies, French companies in particular, which are very strong. So we have here a capacity to help to structure, advice on the financing on this project. Second, there is something very new, which is the Saudi Arabia government is accessing capital markets to finance something new. We were, of course, very proud to be one of the two banks, global coordinator of their recent first Eurobond issues, and we will carry on accompany them on the capital markets. They were very successful in doing that, both in the euro and US dollar market. And of course, thinking about investment and beyond, I would say accompany international companies to invest in Saudi Arabia, and of course, private companies in Saudi Arabia to develop their businesses. There is everything around how to help this new sovereign fund, or at least this sovereign fund with so much more ambition, so much more money to invest in the right way in a difficult environment for investors. And I think as a leading bank in investment solutions, a bank which is connected with the world, I think we have opportunities also to give good advice in the long term to this new investor. But listen, yes, but the good advice should be remunerated. I think it's fair. It's business.
Walk me through in terms of the bridge loan that you guys have done. There are a lot of questions about why you would be raising debt at this point when you have $300 billion under management. Walk me through those numbers and why.
Sure. Let me take a step back. So we have 4 sources of funding for all these projects. One is, of course, a contribution of cash from the government into PIF, and I would say the largest one will be the IPO of Saudi Aramco. The second one is a contribution of assets. A lot of assets, you have land size of countries that have been contributed into PIF. And of course, we have the dividends, interest, the revenues generated by our investment that's also accumulates and that we have to deploy. Lastly, the fourth one was something that we had not used until last year, which is external borrowing. Now, you may ask, why would we borrow in the first place? And in order to answer that question, I think you have to look at our investments. We are present in, I would say, a broader range of investment that other sovereign wealth funds that we see. We go from all the way from infrastructure projects to listed equity. We invest in private equity, we invest in public equity. We invest directly, we invest through managers. So we have all sort of different type of investment that we have. Some of those investments, it just does not make sense to finance them 100% equity. Nobody buys their own house 100% equity. They go and they get a mortgage, right? So we thought, okay, the right mix of capital should have some element of debt. And of course, with debt comes with risk. So we are very prudent in a way that we are looking at our long-term funding strategy, but we decided that there should be some element of debt. So what we've done back in 2017 was to look at, so we looked at the asset side and then we looked at the liability side. Liability side was to say today 100% equity does not make sense. In fact, is even, I would say even we were in a stronger position even than that. Because if you look at our investments, so for example, if you look at 70% interest that we own in STC. STC is the France Telecom of Saudi Arabia. This is the telecom company. The leader in Saudi Arabia. If you look at telecom companies in the world, they are probably one of amongst the most indebted companies because these are asset-heavy companies. So you can actually get a good level of leverage without putting too much risk on those assets. STC is cash positive. So the contrast between the level of debt, or I would say the absence of level of debt, in our participation and also at the level of PIF was quite, I would say, striking. So what we did is that we developed a long-term funding plan that beyond our 3 other sources of funding, we will have other sources of funding. We started executing on that plan. So we put in place a $11 billion bank loan last year in September, and Frédéric and his institution was one of the biggest, I would say, supports for that loan. Thank you, Frédéric. One of the ideas also was that there are too many banking services, advice, and other type of services that we need, and we need to partner up with large institutions in the world. So we partner up with 15 different banks, and we have a very good mix of US, European, Chinese, Japanese banks.
And spreading the love.
Absolutely, because of course, the question was which bank should we go to? And I think we have now, on that side, we have established good partnership, and we are working on that. You referred to SABIC and the bridge loan. So, as I said earlier, that we sold SABIC, we signed this transaction with Saudi Aramco in March. However, we have not completed the transaction. By completing, I mean we have not delivered the shares and we haven't received payment. Now, when you think about it, we are expecting large amounts of funds coming to PIF. We have very little time to deploy those. And again, these are hundreds of billions. This is not dozens of billions. So it is really large amounts that we need to deploy. And for us, wasting 2019, while we are waiting for those funds to come, we thought it would not be the right thing to do. So what we're doing is that we say, okay, how much more capital can we deploy in 2019 in anticipation of those funds hitting the fund? And therefore, we thought, okay, bridge loan, so a short-term borrowing would be probably a good instrument that we can use with the same partners that we have already put in place in order to do that. So that's the idea behind the bridge loan. How much we're gonna borrow is going to be a question of how much more can we deploy in 2019 before this transaction is completed. But I would say anything north of 5 billion, 6 billion would be probably the right type of amount.
And what, in terms of raising debt in the future, what's the timeline on that? You suggested just now that that would be something that you would continue to do.
Sure. Look, I mean, in the near future, the other thing that we need to do is establish a partnership with Saudi banks. I mean, it's a bit surprising because we are also a shareholder of Saudi banks, and I would say this was not the immediate way for us to proceed. So we started with international banks, but we will put also in place a partnership with Saudi banks through a loan, banking loan, very similar to what we did on the US dollar one, but this time in Saudi riyal and probably north of 10 billion riyal. So that is our immediate funding plan. Then I would say in the coming years, the main problem we have is deployment of capital rather funding. However, we learned something from our friends at Saudi Aramco is that it's never good, it's always better to borrow when you're in a very strong position, when you don't need to borrow, right? And we are thinking that if we wanted to have this long-term funding plan executed in the best way, we shouldn't wait until all the capital is deployed before we start tapping whether the bank market or the capital markets. So we will have an active funding plan in place, but of course we will take our time. We will do it in a very prudent way, and we don't have any taboo. So we would look at all instruments available, and we will assess them, whether this makes sense or not for us. Banking loan, I would say it made sense for us because we needed to have partnerships. You don't create partnership by issuing a bond. You do build partnership by borrowing directly from a syndicate of banks. So that's how we started, but that doesn't mean that we're going to stop here. We're going to continue that.
Speaking of that kind of prudence and the partnerships that are required, how difficult does it make your job as the CEO of a large financial institution when something happens like Jamal Khashoggi and the murder? How difficult does that make it for you guys? Because you don't just answer to shareholders, you also answer to the public at large.
Yeah. Perhaps let me just comment on the debt program, just to say, for me, it's a very rational strategy. I mean, Saudi Arabia, the government, the PIF has the luxury and privilege to start from zero and to be able effectively to access very cheap money in practice. There's a lot of money and it was very successful in raising money, effectively to invest in the long term and optimize the funding of all these projects. So I think it's rational, and this mix of banking and bond issues is probably the right one. Listen, I think for me, the commitment has been there and has remained because, as I've said, the development of this country for me is a way to participate to the evolution of the country, to the evolution of the institutions. I feel as an international bank, doing that is helping the population, and I think it's good to keep in touch with the people, with the managers. Of course, I mean, we have all our values, etc., but I mean, beyond, I think that this long-term commitment is very helpful also for the country. So, I did not go last year, but I was there this year, and I've never stopped engaging. And I think that, again, economic development will also help to further change the political regime. So I think that we should remain engaged.
Walk me through what's exciting for the Public Investment Fund next, because there has been some speculation of a second Softbank fund, a second Vision Fund. Would that be something that you'd be involved in?
Well, when you have so much funds to deploy and make a difference in a whole country, and I would say in whole sectors of industries, if you look at the tech sector, if you look at the renewable energy sector, what I started by saying is that we want to be the most impactful fund in the world, sovereign wealth fund. So that's a big statement. So, I mean, if you're not excited by that, I don't know what you're gonna be excited about, you know. So, look, we are going to assess different investments. As I said, we will have investments directly in companies, and we will have also investments through fund managers. You mentioned Softbank Vision Fund. Softbank Vision Fund is our largest commitment outside of Saudi Arabia, $45 billion that we committed to Softbank Vision Fund, and we will look at other opportunities, whether it's Softbank or others.
So you'd be open to investing in a second Vision Fund?
Well, we will assess that, but the same way I would say that we look at all instruments on the debt side, we will also look at all types of different investments, as long as, of course, they tick the boxes for us. Let me add something, maybe because we are in a country with negative rates. In France. And I think one of the challenges we see around the world in developed economy, and probably in Europe, I would be curious to hear Frédéric's views on that, is that growth is slow. And it's very difficult to deploy capital. If you look at our rate of returns that we require on our investments, these are high single-digit numbers. It's very difficult to attain those single-digit numbers in a slowing economy. If you look at Saudi Arabia really has it all, because we are a growth economy, we are an emerging economy, and we are not negative. So we still in the capital markets we offer a good yield for investors compared to a 10-year German bond that literally you have to pay people to lend money to them. I mean, it's a crazy situation. We're getting used to it, but it's not a natural position to be in. In Saudi Arabia, we have both exciting projects, whether it is the new sector development. You know, they are, I don't know, I'm sure the audience has seen that we have opened this new cinemas in Saudi Arabia. So the entertainment sector, the tourism sector. We don't need to bring people from outside in Saudi. We need to make sure that people within Saudi, they have access to entertainment, they have access to tourism, they have access to the things that today was lacking, which meant people took the plane to go to a neighboring country and then come back. Only if we stop that already, a country of 30 million people, that's a huge opportunity. So we really have it all, meaning that we have the opportunity, we have the vision, and we have the means to deploy and success this vision. Of course, execution is the key there, and we are doing our bit to make sure that the execution, we get it right.
Frédéric, I wanted to bring you in on that as well, as to talk about the renewables, because I know that's a space that you're very concerned about.
Well, you know, again, I think that this commitment to limit the increase of temperature and climate change is at the heart now, certainly of European governments, public opinion, and banks in Europe, in France, and Société Générale in particular. I'm very proud that we are one of the leaders in that field. We have just to, and when we talk about amounts, it's big. We have committed to finance for more than, contribute to the financing of more than 100 billion euros between 2016 and 2020. We have already achieved 78% of that, so it means I think we will do more in practice. So we talk about really big money, and I must say I've seen in the last 10 years the change. We started from technology which were in practice requesting public subsidy. With the progress in terms of technology, more maturity, whether it's solar, wind, etc., today you have effectively I would say, self-standing projects which are competitive. And we were talking about the price of solar electricity in Saudi Arabia, which are incredibly low. And clearly, it's an obvious choice for Saudi Arabia to complement the energy production mix. So we are going to carry on, and it's, I think, an absolute necessity. And typically, I think we can bring a lot, as I've said, because we are one of the world champions in that, in Saudi Arabia, but elsewhere, in Africa, in South America, in Europe. There are plenty of different fields. So yes, it's a very clear shift. We have further committed to reduce coal. I mean, we are going to progressively, all banks are going to exit coal. And the production mix of electricity is changing dramatically. Today, in our mix of assets, we have less than 50% of fossil energy to produce electricity. So this shift is taking place. And I must say that's where the Saudi project is very interesting, because it's a country which, of course, benefits from the huge resource of oil, but which has to think long-term, 30, 50 years ahead, and effectively think that there's a need to diversify, because who knows what in 50 years ahead the price of oil will be and the consumption. So I think that's where it's important to diversify the mix of the economy.
And a long-term strategy is needed.
Absolutely. Yes, in that field. In that field, we have to think 2050. Let's face it, because we need also to precisely ensure growth. The difficulty is this balance between, of course, transition and still providing growth to economies which depend on electricity. And renewable will not be able to bring immediately, permanently, the electricity which is needed for growth. And these populations deserve growth. We cannot just say, as rich countries, forget it, and that's it.
Gentlemen, before I let you go, I want you to weigh in on what your concerns are
Numéro 5.
For the next year, in terms of what we're seeing in terms of the global growth, but also in terms of what we're seeing from the U.S. president, who is considered to be an outlier. What are the things that concern you? Are we talking about climate change specifically? Are we talking about the president of the United States? Where do you see the headwinds?
Sure. I'd say for us as an investor, of course, we are impacted by a slowdown in the economies of the world. And, the big debate there is how the discussions between China and the US will go, whether we will have a trade war or not, what will be the impact of this of these events on the economy, because ultimately, we will invest in assets. Those assets will grow with the economies of their sector, of their countries, and therefore a global slowdown is not good for us from a investor point of view. Having said that, we have a big advantage to, I would say, institutional investors, because we have a very long horizon of investment. We are not like a private equity company to come in, buy an asset, and have an exit date. We don't have an exit date, and therefore we can be patient. We can take our time, and in a way, in periods where there's a lot of concern in the in people's mind, and where valuations are low, that's actually a good opportunity for us to invest at the right level of valuation for the long term. So you can see it both as a sort of a concern, but also as an opportunity.
Well, I think that our central scenario is effectively a slowdown of the world economy, a progressive one, more acute in 2020, 2021 than 2019. Clearly, you can imagine risk which can derail that kind of scenario, at least create even further uncertainty. And of course, it seems to me that we have to think that, yes, there can be a shock in the financial system. I mean, a correction on certain valuations which are high. And at the same time, let's not forget that central banks will keep pretty accommodative policy. Central bank in Europe, we had in mind 18 months ago potential increase of rates. It's postponed, and the Fed, instead of carrying on increasing rates, will probably decrease its rate at some point. So this helps also to amortize the shock. May I say, for the time being, we see nothing catastrophic, but probably, yes, we are now not very far from the end of this cycle. At the same time, is it in anybody's interest to really create something which would derail a minimum level of economy, I have my doubt, whatever it comes from.
Nothing catastrophic is the good news.
Again, by definition, if there's a catastrophe, you don't predict it. It's not, so I'm very prudent. But again, central scenario is something progressive, a pretty, yes, a slowdown, in particular in 2020, but not the end of the world.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And I'd like to now introduce His Excellency, Egypt's Finance Minister, Mohammed Mait.
Good evening, everybody. I would like to express my gratitude to the Paris Europe Place International Financial Forum for today's event, and I'm happy to be speaking to you about the emerging capital markets and Egypt. Despite the challenges that have faced the emerging market last year, the potential lies in our markets, and we are seeing more interest from the foreign investment community. Therefore, we would like to seize the opportunity and to develop our markets and keep on thriving to put ourselves on the radar. I would like also to speak about what are the main pillars which we have worked on in Egypt over the last years in order to improve our capital markets in Egypt. Number one was improving the economic outlook and GDP growth in Egypt. On this front, Egypt GDP growth moved from 2% to 6% for the year 2019-2020, and also from a budget deficit from around 17% 4 years ago to now 7.2%, and from a primary deficit of 8.4% to a 2% primary surplus, 2% of GDP primary surplus, and also our debt, which was 2 years ago 108% of GDP, is now below 90%. On the other side, we have also improved our hard currency reserves, which was below 3 months of imports 3 years ago, is now more than 8.5 months of imports. This is in addition to the reduction in unemployment, which reduced from 14% to below 9% now, and inflation reduced from a very high level of 36% to now is between 12 to 14%, and we are expecting that all these figures will improve significantly. Let me say that our main driver for growth was some of the reform in the sectors, in economic sectors like construction, tourism, industry, oil and gas, and also manufacturing, which also helped us to reduce our current account deficit to below 2%, and also creating millions of new jobs and improved our investment climate and the environment. If we add to that we are aiming for achieving 7% GDP growth over the coming period of 2019 to 2022, which means that we are opening our market for more and more investment in many significant sectors. As it was mentioned now, Egypt has built the biggest solar electricity station in the world, in Pimpan, in Aswan, and is investing hugely on renewables, and it becomes one of the main attractive sectors in Egypt with a lot of investment in renewables. Egypt 3-4 years ago used to have 18 hours of electricity cut-off a day, is now having a surplus of electricity, which is trying to share it with our neighbors. now we moved from a country who used to import natural gas 2 years ago is now as an exporter of natural gas, and also with our neighbors from Italy, Greece, Cyprus, Israel, and Lebanon, we have created a forum in Egypt for the producer and consumers of natural gas in order to develop this very important sector of energy. On the other side, let me say, in the coming few years, we are concentrating more on human capital development with investment in education, health. Egypt has introduced a couple of days ago the first universal health coverage for the whole population, which will be gradually covering 105 million of the Egyptians. Let me move to other points which contributed to the improvement of our economy and our emerging market. Transparency. Investors can mitigate any risks, but only if they are aware of it. Therefore, we are working on publishing our medium-term strategies on our website, which is being very well received by our foreign investors. Also reducing the foreign investment restriction, and I'm proud to say that Egypt has eliminated all the restrictions for foreign investment as part of our incentive schemes, enhancing the legislative framework in order to observe introducing new products that are on a par with international standards and best practice, focusing on structural reform and infrastructure enhancement. Technology and the infrastructure are of essence in developing our markets in order to conform to international standards. Increasing liquidity, all of the above pillars shall increase the liquidity on the debt instruments side as well as on the equity side, finding alternatives to increase liquidity such as being euro-clearable and joining the international indices such as JP Morgan Emerging Market Index to the fixed income, which Egypt is already working on. Another dimension which I would like to talk about is Africa and African investment. Let me mention to what has been signed just 2 days ago by the African Leaders Summit, which is African Free Trade Area, which was signed by 54 countries. And I see this is a big opportunity because this will mean that a market of 1.2 billion African citizens will be open for, and also with $3.4 trillion of GDP, and also will contribute significantly to increase the inter-countries trade, which we are expecting this will increase the level of inter-trade by African countries from the current level of 15% to, we hope, it can be 60% in the coming near future by 2025, for example. And I believe this is a very good opportunities for investors, particularly that Africa needs more investment because it represents, as it was mentioned, a good opportunities and good challenges. One of the biggest challenges is infrastructure investment, which I believe it will be very important for the coming period because Africa represents a good opportunity for growth, a good opportunity for investment, and we are in Egypt. We are ready to help with that because we are part of Africa, and we think that we can play a good role as Egypt can represent a gate for African investment, particularly that we have this new signed Africa Free Trade Area, which also represent for Egypt a good opportunity because of the location, because of the many a very good infrastructure. We are in a good position to be used to facilitate trade within Africa and within many countries. So I believe that today, after this signing of the free trade area for for African countries will represent a good opportunity for investors. And finally, I would like to stress on the importance of the capital markets being the mirror of any economy, and that the mutual cooperation between the emerging markets and the sharing of best practices is a milestone in developing our markets. I thank you very much again for the kind invitation, and I look forward to welcoming you all in Egypt to see the reform by yourself and to help Africa from the Egypt gate to achieve its ambitious objective for growth and human capital development. Thank you very much.
We launched our first product in 2016.
Your Excellency, thank you so much.
Thank you.